Well, good morning, everyone. This is the March edition of the Textile of the Month Club, and today we're discussing Karo Ori. Kara, just to get you familiar with the terms, Kara actually means Chinese or the Tang Dynasty, I believe it was. There were different waves of imported information into Japan over the centuries. So last time we talked about Min Suzure in terms of Chinese Ming Dynasty. Okay, and that was one wave of influence that came in during the Ming period. Well, then during the Tang Dynasty, called Kara in Japanese, a whole nother group of information came in and influences. So what you'll find sometimes are things that have the word Chinese in whatever form attached to the word. Sometimes it is from China, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's really just means new and improved. It has no meaning. It'll be stuck onto another word, sometimes just to make it sound better. It's like in our advertising, when we'll say 20% more. Well, 20% more of what? That doesn't matter. 20% more just sounds better. Kara something, mean something, just sounds better from a marketing standpoint. It sounds exotic and sophisticated. Maybe in the United States, sometimes we'll use a French phrase for something because it sounds more romantic or exotic or sophisticated. So think of it in that way sometimes. Now, originally what happened with the Karo Ori, the Japanese were trying to imitate the very expensive Chinese hand embroideries that were coming in. They're really exquisite embroideries. And the Japanese wanted to be able to produce their own, but not quite with that much labor, trying to find a little bit more efficient way of doing it. So they developed this weaving technique that we'll go into in a moment. And it does have very much an embroidered look to it. But in the end, what wound up happening, it was far more work than the embroidery was. The difference is between this and the embroidery is that embroidery can be a one-off item. One-off meaning that you have complete control. You can do little sections. You can change it as you go along. You can do whatever you like with it. Okay. However, in the case of the Karo Ori, you're setting up a very elaborate loom. So once you have all the complexity of the plotting and planning, then you're going to have to pretty much stick to that. However, you can vary colors as you go along, even if the pattern is set. And the one advantage to this is once you have all that mechanical calculation set up, you can do it over and over and over again with much less effort than the embroidery. Okay, so let's go ahead and start in on the video itself here. Let's do the share screen, and here we go. Okay. All righty. So the image that's actually on the screen at the moment is of a very old Karaori piece. You can see some of the patchwork and the stitching that's been done. When you're starting with Karo Ori, because it requires very careful calculations, you have to start with a cartoon. So there are artists who specialize in drawing the cartoons for the prototype, for the weaving. So in this case, this artist you can see is doing a series of pine trees. And because we're dealing with our sample for this month is 24 karat gold, he's going to be doing his design work with gold as part of the theme as well. Normally what you'll do is mix up your pigments and then even whether you're doing it on glass, as you saw him doing it there in a spatula, whether you're doing it in a mortar and pestle, the final step is always to grind it with your fingers in the bowl. Because by doing it with your finger, you can feel the size of the particles and make sure that there are no chunks, that everything is absolutely blended. Now, the colorants, the pigments that he's using are the same kind of pigments that we would use in Bingata style dyeing. So here you see the gold leaf background, you see the different pigments built up. And then next that will go on to an expert dyer who will match those colors as closely as he can, quite precisely actually. And these are synthetic dyes in this case. And what I'll ask you to notice is the tool he's using to spin the yarn. It's a hook type thing that allows it to spin very efficiently. And then as he matches the different colors, he'll adjust test, adjust, and test until he has precisely what the artist indicated on the cartoon. And here you can see him matching colors. And adjusting is necessary in creating the full range. So again, this is a very typical way of dyeing Japanese yarns. They get even coverage. There's no tangling in the process. This hook allows you to go in and spin the yarns very efficiently. Okay. So here you see, looking up into the ceiling with all of the yarns drying, the range that he has planned for this particular project. And here again are some of the colors. Okay, and if you could all turn off your sounds, please, that would help also. Okay, and so here we have them preparing the different spools for the yarn. Okay, the bobbins for it. So I'm going to stop here just a second. What I want you to take note of are all of these bobbins lined up. These are the bobbins with the thread that she just wound onto it from the reel. These are all laid out in a very specific sequence with a specific number in mind. Sits in a predetermined position, its number indicated on the bobbin itself. These are then tied in preparation for preparing the warp threads, each of those bobbins number corresponding to the loop you just saw, and those in turn corresponding to each of the holes in this curved card. Those go through the reed, and now you can see that he's preparing the weft threads on this very large warping wheel. Okay, so you can see how wide this is. This is just a very narrow portion of, so he's going to be doing many of these bundles to create one warp. He has a little measuring device, sort of like when we measure yardage in a yardage store, that calculates off, that measures off the meters being reeled out so that they're all completely even by the time he has all of the threads for his final warp prepared on that large drum. And those in turn are tied off and set aside for later for when the weaver is ready. So he's the warp preparer, obviously. Now, last time we did talk about the different types of Jacquard cards. In another episode, what we'll do is talk about how those are punched. But for right now, you see that each one of these cards has a series of holes in it. Those holes, as you know, help to lift the different heddles, which help to control the patterning. That's what I was talking about when I said so much preparation work. Mathematical calculations need to go into this because every single card represents one weft thread. Okay, one pass of the weft. And so you can imagine that with a very complex repeating pattern, you need just a massive bundle of these threads prepared. So here the loom is in action, the warp threads being lifted. Okay, and you can see the devices lifting the heddle. And here is where a lot of the control can come in. Even though the pattern is set, the artist can vary the colors that are used. So each of these little small bobbins each of these small shuttles rather, have different colors of threads, and he's weaving as he goes. There's a mirror on the bottom side that he can keep track of the pattern, but the back side is what's always up. Now, in his particular case, he's not using the cards from the Jacquard loom. This is still called a Jacquard loom, but he's using a computer-assisted one. Okay, it's the computer that's driving the pattern, not the cards. It allows for much more efficient changes, and there's no degradation of the cards over time. Okay, so here's his schematic drawing of the different colors being used, samples of the yarns to make sure he's got them correctly, the little mini shuttles. Okay. Reminds me a little bit of a maypole dance, trying to keep track of each of these as you go along. Notice, since this is the back, how the threads are also floating across. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you can see in the mirror if any flaws are developing. Okay, and that gives you just a small range of some of the colors. So let's look at how that thread fits into the warp itself, into the weave of the structure. So basically you have a pretty balanced weave as the groundwork for it. So these are what could be called supplemental wefts. The difference also between the actual warp and the actual weft threads, which are well spun threads. So they're a little hard, they're tightly spun. But the supplemental yarn is more of a floss. It's not spun, okay? It has a very fluffy, soft, flossy look to it so that it puffs up just a little bit, giving it a much more of an embroidered look. In Japanese and Chinese embroidery, generally speaking, they use this type of a floss thread. So again, with the idea of imitating embroidery work, the floss is allowed to fluff up and give that hand-stitched look. And so this is a good example of that. Now notice all of the threads, unlike embroidery, do follow the direction of the weft, but also notice how padded they look, how fluffy they look. And this is a view from the backside. So the sample on the right is the front, the sample on the left is the back. Quite often with Karo Ori, the threads will travel all the way from selvage to selvage, but not necessarily. On the back here, you can see that with this lavender color, the artist is going back and forth, filling in just the section needed with that bobbin. And you can see the corresponding portion on the front side. So what that does is it gives that embroidered look with the least amount of yarn. This particular sample has the so-called embroidered areas spaced out. There are others where the embroidery, such as the sample you were sent, is very heavily padded in this way. And so when you look at the back, you really can't see the balanced weave at all. All you're seeing are the threads traveling across the back. That in turn creates a nice padding to the finished garment and gives it a slightly quilted feel. Not quilted in terms of texture, but just in terms of fluff. And that's also typical of Karo Ori. You can also see in this sample quite a bit of gold thread was used. So this is a sample from my collection, okay? It's a Karo Ori weave. What I like about this particular sample is you can see it came with samples of all of the threads used in the weave itself. Now, this particular one, I'm not going to open up to show you the back because it is a finished piece, but I think you have a notion of what that would be like. Okay, and here's a detail. So again, let's stop for a moment. Look at the difference between, let's say, this flower and this flower, okay? This one is using flat bands of gold, and this one is using slightly more spun bands of gold. We'll go over how that spinning takes place in a moment. Okay, but this gives you a difference in texture. This has more of a mirror-like reflection. This one has more of a sparkle-like reflection. Notice also how the flossy threads do create very much an embroidered look in both the white and the colored. Often in Karo Ori, you will have the thread go all the way from the edge of a shape back again. But when it's quite long, sometimes they will break it up with this additional patterning. Really nice ones will hide that by staggering the patterning so that you don't get this extra line. It's simply a matter of artistic difference. This is a very good quality piece. Okay, this gives you an idea of the overall patterning involved. Okay, a little bit more detail. Okay, and this is a good example here of the flossiness. So here again, look at the difference in the golds, look at the difference in the floss. Okay, and let's go back and look at the colors just a bit more for a moment. This is giving you the history of the company and the background of the weaving itself. And as I mentioned, this gives you a sample of every single color silk used in the weave along with its name. The names aren't, unfortunately, they're not giving the names. These are synthetic dyes, but this one, just as an example, says pale pine needle color. Okay. This one's white silver as an example. Okay, they're just different ones like that. This one is pale silver. Just different, it's pretty straightforward descriptions of the colors of the names. So this is the gold also that may be spun, maybe twisted, maybe flat, as you saw. When we're talking about the gold itself, the title, the names that come on these bolts vary, but they all mean gold. One of them is Junkin, which are the characters that you see right here, which means simple gold or pure gold, okay? There are other ones that are Honkin, which means real gold, and they're similar names to this. They all mean the same thing. What these numbers are indicating, though, is how you get this color of gold, because you want many different ranges of shades. And so this one, even though it's pure gold to start with, this 94.5% gold plus 5% Jungin, so real silver. And then there's just 0.5% basically of copper added to it. And that's what this is giving you, basically the formula to get that color of gold. And then we come back down here, which is called plum color. And it'll tell you that it's 90% pure gold plus roughly 9% of silver, and again, 0.5% of the copper, and so on down the line. So each of these different colors you're looking at have a specific percentage and formula that comes with it. And if the dye house, if the weaving house gives you, quite often they come with a pamphlet that tells you as much information as you'd like to know. If it gives you the color of the gold, let's say it said plum gold, then you would know automatically how much gold was in it, how much silver, and how much copper was in it based on the name. Those are standardized. So this gold is laminated to handmade paper. So first of all, let's take a glance at the paper. Here they're preparing the fibers for the paper maker. He's dipping it in and screening out the fibers to make this very, very thin variety. This paper that he's making is the same kind of paper, the same quality paper that's used on the Japanese 10,000 yen note. So very rugged, very durable paper. And he's piling layer after layer as he builds them up. The next, we need to prepare the gold. So the gold has been pounded out to within really just a few molecules thickness. She's cutting it now into standardized squares. The excess gold will go back into the pot and be recycled again. And these, again, go into the standardized sheets that we think of as leaves for gold leafing. Each is separated by a paper, and this paper is used to pick up the gold because it's so very thin. And you'll notice what happens is she rubs the paper slightly. That creates a static electricity charge that makes the gold stick to the paper so she can lift both. It also curls the edge so she can pick it up. If she misses a spot, she can always go in and rub some more. This sort of ochre color is lacquer, real lacquer that's been applied to the paper. They're going along and cementing the gold to the paper using the lacquer as the bonding agent. They're working on a massively long piece. So this is going to be a warp thread, a very, very long warp thread. And the threads are cut once the spool of paper is done with a machine like this. It's a bit like a guillotine going along and chopping through many, many layers at the same time so that you have a uniform width of thread throughout. There are different weaving techniques that this gold is used for. It's being prepared for, I'm going to stop for a second. If it were being prepared for a warp, it would be cut the entire length, obviously. If it's being prepared for the weft, it doesn't need to be that long, and it's cut into papers that are specific to the weave, so a little bit wider than the weave itself. So here they have all of this cut up. In this case, now what she's going to do is use this gold thread to wrap around a cotton or silk core. And that's what he's doing here. He's breaking it off into little sections, and you can see all the strands below him. Okay, now once he's got that, now he can separate them. It was necessary to keep all of these strands together with this border edge because you don't want them getting tangled. So she has a bundle of them under this checkered cloth here. And as she spins her yarn, she's going to pull out one strand, a flat strand of gold. Now remember, there's gold on one side, blank paper on the other. So she wants to make sure and get it right with the gold side out and not have it twist on her accidentally. So as she carries that up the thread and runs out to the end of the paper, she'll go in and splice in another strip of paper, as you see her doing here. And then she will continue this until she has enough to do the weaving for this particular project. So this is all intensive handwork. Okay, from there it goes to the bobbin. From the bobbin, it's going onto this large wooden board. And once the board is completed, that's going to be removed and put into tied off into these little skeins. Okay, and this is the standardized skein that you would find for embroidery, for weaving, for any project that you would use gold thread for, couching and so forth as well. It's made in all different thicknesses depending on the project. There are also a lot of synthetic gold, not real gold. To make the synthetic gold, which is also quite beautiful, other types of metal, silver as an example, will be laminated to the paper, and then a gold film will be placed over the top to give it the yellow. It's still very good quality silver base, but you can get a whole range of blues and silvers and golds and pinks by putting this plastic film over the top of the silver, and the plastic film prevents the silver from tarnishing later. It too is wrapped around the yarn in the same way. So you can see this type of yarn is used for things, and Karo Ori is used for that type of Buddhist robe, or traditionally it was also originally very widely used for no theater costumes. So this is the back of one of the samples. Now each of you will have slightly different samples because these are all one of a kind, and I'm cutting the samples from different spots on them. So yours will vary a bit, but this gives you an idea of what I was talking about in the background. There is so much embroidered look on the front that the back has a lot of threads traveling across it, giving it a very padded look. Okay, and so this is as it would appear in your sample, of course, with the back cut so that you can see it. And then this is one sample of the type of gold that went out. And so here you can see the top of the irises have this very embroidered look. The mandarin ducks in this case have it. The gold is all in this background. And each of you will have a different version of this. And then lastly, here's one that actually looks much more embroidered. Now, this one doesn't have any gold in it, but it does give you very much that embroidered feel. And this is what they were striving towards in developing this Karo Ori process. Okay, and so that pretty much covers what we have for this section. Thank you for joining me. So we'll go ahead and break now and go on to question and answers for our regular group. Okay, so you can all come on now if you'd like to.